These three are the criminologists, and then I'm the law student and Fels student. We propose to institute a system of kiosks that people on probation and parole can use to check in with their probation and parole officers. Our proposal is smart in two different senses. First, it leverages technology to more effectively track ex-offenders, and second, it could save the city $1 million in incarceration costs. In the next 10 minutes, I will explain how the current probation and parole system works in Philadelphia, how that system contributes to the high crime rates in Philadelphia. Then I will outline our proposal to place kiosks in Philadelphia neighborhoods and explain why this is the right time to move forward with this initiative. Now, probation and parole, for those of you who do not watch Law and Order religiously, are two ways in which the state monitors ex-offenders in lieu of incarceration. Probation is a sentence given in place of going to prison, so the offender never goes to prison. Parole, on the other hand, is used so an offender can complete their sentence in the community. In Philadelphia, the Adult Probation and Parole Department, or APPD, is the agency responsible for supervising these individuals. There are 43,000 people on probation and parole in Philadelphia. To give you the context for this number, that is approximately the size of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The largest category of ex-offenders is labeled as low risk. Low-risk ex-offenders are required to check in approximately twice a year with their probation officers. What this means is that they are required to travel to Center City, wait in a line for approximately 2 or 3 hours to get through security, speak to a parole or probation officer for approximately 5 to 10 minutes, just giving their address, their employment status, and explain if they've had any contact with law enforcement in the previous 6 months. Moderate risk and high risk offenders report to their POs in Center City, probation officer, also called POs, in Center City more frequently, and may be required to submit to drug tests or electronic monitoring. The terms low risk, moderate risk, and high risk offenders come from the risk model developed by UPenn professor Richard Berger. Philadelphia uses this model because it has been successful in predicting future behavior. The risk model takes into account various characteristics that are likely to predict future likelihood of offense, including an individual's criminal history, employment status, family support, and the nature of the crime committed. Low-risk offenders are unlikely to commit any crime in the next 2 years. Moderate-risk offenders are unlikely to commit a violent crime in the next 2 years. And high-risk offenders are likely to commit a violent crime in the next 2 years. High-risk offenders pose special dangers to Philadelphia. In August of 2012, Philadelphia police officer Moses Walker Jr. was killed as he walked to a bus stop in North Philadelphia after he finished an overnight shift. The man accused of killing him is Raphael Jones, a man who was under APPD supervision at the time of the shooting. Jones had just been released from prison approximately 10 days prior to the shooting, after serving 4 years on a gun charge. Under the conditions of his probation, he was supposed to be subject to drug screening, electronic monitoring, and house arrest. Somehow, Jones slipped through the cracks in the system, and the electronic monitoring system was never put in place. If APPD officers had more time to spend tracking high-risk offenders, this is the type of crime that could be prevented. Unfortunately, the story of Officer Walker is not an isolated story. Philadelphia has the 3rd highest crime rate in the US, ahead of New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. And a substantial portion of these crimes are committed by people who are either on probation or parole. In fact, 37% of parolees and probationers reoffend each year, and the list of supervisees grows by 18,000 each year. As you can see, if we look at the whole pie of the prison population, you can see that 21% of people who are in prison in Philadelphia are there just because of parole and probation violations. And that's not including the percentage of the other ones, the pretrial, or the ones who are already sentenced, who are on probation or parole when they committed their offenses and were sentenced. Our team seeks to change the way this probation system operates. We propose an electronic kiosk system for low-risk offenders that would operate in neighborhoods with the highest concentration of parolees and probationers. The kiosks would be placed in easily accessible locations that already serve the ex-offender community, thinking of offices of state representatives or at nonprofit organizations. Low-risk ex-offenders would use these kiosks rather than report to the POs in Center City. For example, a low-risk offender who lives and works in North Philadelphia could use his lunch hour to go to the kiosk. The individual would have two choices. First, he could quickly check in at the kiosk. It takes approximately 5 minutes. There's a fingerprint system that would scan to verify the individual's identity, and then they would answer all the questions that they would normally answer from a PO. Second, the individual could check in at the kiosk, but also choose to speak to a community relations officer, which is a probation officer that would be there to staff the kiosk between business hours. This officer could assist the parolees and probationers with any issues they are having and help connect them to available services that are either on site or in the neighborhood where they live. We would place the first kiosk in North Philadelphia because the highest number of probationers and parolees reside there. On the slide, you can see the population of supervised ex-offenders by neighborhood, as well as a population density map of ex-offenders. The first kiosk would serve approximately 600 low-risk probationers. 2 years later, we would attempt to expand this number and implement 5 to 10 additional kiosks. This number would serve the entire population of low-risk ex-offenders in the city. This is a community-based strategy that would benefit the POs, the ex-offenders, and the communities. We estimate that a 2-year pilot initiative would cost approximately $20,800, which includes the kiosk and overhead costs. Each check-in costs the city only $2. We are proposing to create a graduate student fellowship position within the city to help secure funds for the initiative. Based on the deadlines for the largest federal grants, we propose that the fellowship begin in the fall of 2013. After securing funding in 2014, APPD would launch the pilot initiative in January of 2015. APPD would compile a 1-year progress report in January of 2016, and then the citywide initiative would begin in 2017. Now, APPD has attempted to implement kiosks in the past, but the city has never provided the funding. So why is this the right time for the initiative? Well, first, our initiative connects ex-offenders to the communities in order to provide more sustainable rehabilitation efforts. This is critical at a time when, right now, 70% of parolees and probationers are unemployed in the current job market. Second, PO's caseloads are at a breaking point. Each officer handles between 50 and 350 cases, and each officer must do his own data entry. There is a citywide need for a centralized database that includes offender information and social services. A kiosk system would significantly improve the city's databases, and most importantly, this data would prevent ex-offenders like Jones from slipping through the cracks. Third, kiosks have an established record of success in other cities, including New York City. And finally, kiosks are now more affordable than ever. New York has been using kiosks for over a decade with impressive results. During a 4-year period, New York found that its rearrest rates dropped 8% for high-risk probationers and 3% for low-risk probationers. High risk are on the left and low risk are on the right. New York's success was in part a matter of resource allocation. Since low-risk ex-offenders were using the kiosks rather than reporting to POs, New York was able to devote more staff time to the high-risk offenders. New York was able to increase its high-risk PO staff from 154 to 181. In addition to caseload adjustments, probation officers no longer had to spend hours on manual data entry. Other cities have had similar success. Maryland found a substantial reduction in rearrests, and Washington, D.C., and the state of Florida have successfully implemented kiosks to reduce the strain on their probation systems. This initiative relies on support from stakeholders in the Court of Common Pleas, the Mayor's Office, and community organizations. We have spoken to many of these individuals on the screen over the last 2 months, and we have incorporated their feedback into our proposal. After speaking to our community partners, especially the Chief of Probation, Robert Malvestuto, and the Deputy Court Administrator, Joe Lanzalotti, we believe that it's time to bring probation and parole back to the communities. We propose a smart reform that has worked well in other cities with similar populations. And regardless of the outcome of this challenge, we think it is one that the city should pursue aggressively for the safety of all Philadelphians. Thank you. And we will now take questions from the judges.
Since you said New York has been doing it for a decade, are you able to, in some way, look at the cost benefit, exactly what it is meant in terms of saving dollars? I noticed you weren't able to tell us what would it mean to the city's budget.
Do you know where that slide is?
Go for it.
We'll find it. Yeah, so it's right there. So based on the reduction New York saw, if you assume a similar reduction in Philadelphia, and this is conservative, we're just talking about the 3% decline for the low risk, not considering their high risk decline, you would save $1.5 million annually, and that's just taking into account the cost of rearrest, not the cost of, estimated cost of crime to the city.
Did they in turn reinvest that money back into the same budget?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you know an idea?
I don't know how much people read about New York, but as you've seen, overall their crime rates have been dropping, so they've been reinvesting it in basically their whole crime overall, so police officers, probation, everything.
So they didn't have to really invest any new money. They just really made some changes in terms of priorities of how they were spending the money.
Yes.
Right.
It was more of a reallocation of resources, and just kind of one of the statistics we also looked at is it's $35,000 a year to incarcerate one individual, and our entire program costs $25,000. So just to kind of put that in perspective, you would definitely see savings over time, and New York obviously saw similar savings.
One last question. You showed New York, Maryland. I think you showed Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. Why has it been happening here?
So in the past, they've tried to implement it, but even though the overall crime budget in Philadelphia is rather large, parole and probation has a very small portion of that budget, and they have not been allocated the money to be able to fund this without having to let people go, and they don't want to fund a new program if it means firing people.
To follow on Representative Evans' comments, I think the budget issue and how we capture and reallocate savings that a program like this would capture is a real challenge in terms of trying to drive different departments to implement something new, try a new program that hasn't necessarily been proven here. Are there incentives or sort of like cheese that you could ultimately provide that would guarantee that the savings stays with the department where this is coming from?
Yes, so we've actually been looking towards federal grants in terms of kicking off this program. And essentially how that works is we're looking towards Second Chance Act funding and Department of Justice funding. The Justice Assistance Bureau has recently given the state of Maryland, for example, money to start their kiosk system. So we're really looking towards a federal grant at no cost to Philadelphia local government to really kickstart this program. That being said, we also expect to see savings over time, like we talked about, with the incarceration rate going down, recidivism rates going down, reoffending going down. So we definitely are aiming this program towards APBD, and they are overburdened and underfunded right now. So I think by using kiosks that limit the amount of data entry probation officers have to do, that allow probation officers to really spend more time with those high-risk offenders, those high-needs offenders, I think it's a really solid way of keeping the savings where they should be, and then potentially in the future even reinvesting that back into the community for other justice initiatives involved with reentry, which is a big problem right now.
For our streaming audience, would you answer all questions into the microphone?
Oh, sure.
Sorry.
I had a question. From the point of view of the parolee or the person on probation, in other cities, have you heard any downsides, for example, privacy? Also, I was wondering about drug testing and all that.
So actually, you ask a very interesting question. DC actually doesn't publish the locations of their kiosks to keep them private so that no one knows, like, oh, everyone going into that building must be an ex-offender because they're checking in. And drug testing in Philadelphia, a very small portion of the low-risk offenders even need drug testing. It's like 20 a month. So it wouldn't be an issue for them. If there's someone who would be required drug testing, they would obviously go to APPD to check in and get their test done. But as for the community, as you can see from these graphs, the community in Philadelphia both thinks crime is a serious problem and that the criminal justice system here isn't very effective, which is a problem, especially in a city like Philadelphia where crime is such a everyday central issue. And while we wouldn't be able to tell the communities that we were necessarily putting the kiosk there for the privacy rights, to tell them, like, the people who would be having access to the kiosk in their neighborhood already live there. We wouldn't be bringing in people from West Philadelphia to North Philadelphia. We would only be having the people in North Philadelphia already check in. So they're already your neighbors, your friends, whoever.
Have they done focus groups with parolees or probation, with folks on probation? How do you feel about the kiosks and other things?
Not that I know of. Anecdotally, we talked to some people from Wilmington where they do it at the federal probation level, and they just anecdotally told us that the probationers like it. Those who just kind of want to get their probation done with and get through with it, they like it a lot because it allows them to do that most efficiently. And for those who need extra help, it's freed up. We talked to a probation officer who says that she now basically has time when she has a more, I guess for lack of a better word, kind of a more needy client, somebody who needs more help, she can actually give them that help, whereas before she just kind of had to say, sorry, I don't have time. So I think in that sense it works out for everybody.
Congratulations to all of you.
Thanks.
I was wondering a little more from the stakeholders' point of view. Anecdotally, you've had evidence from DOs and others that they think this would be a very positive step. Did you get any negative feedback?
So we talked to, as we said before, we talked to Chief Malvestuto and Deputy Lancelotti, and they think it's a good idea. Lancelotti especially likes the idea that we're bringing POs back into the community because a while ago that's how it was, and so they were able to direct their probation and parole officer or probation and parolees to local resources. And now that they're all in Center City, they really have no idea what's going on. So they liked that idea. At the end, they basically said, like, it's a good idea, but we don't have the funding to do it ourselves. So that's why we're looking into federal grants as an alternative.
And I was thinking from the other cities who have implemented this and shown this real success in terms of numbers and percentages, is there anything we can learn from their experience that applies here in Philadelphia? Is there anything we launch this?
Actually, I think this is a great time for Philadelphia to be running this program because we can look at other cities and kind of troubleshoot from their experiences. And one of the major perks of Philadelphia following other cities in this is that New York is willing to give us the software for the kiosk for free, which is a large expense. It's approximately $5,000. And considering, the issues in the past with Philadelphia bringing these kiosks here has been funding, that software is essentially invaluable. And there are great reports that have been published on New York City, and I think one of the things that we can look at, in terms of what New York City did is their reallocation of resources and how that extra time spent with high-risk probationers has really affected the crime rates overall. And just in terms of demography and neighborhood structure, Philadelphia can follow what New York has done and kind of learn from it. And we do expect in the coming years also, by the time the pilot is up and running, we'll get that information from DC as well when they release it. A lot of these programs have been started within the last couple of years. So we're really fortunate to be able to look at other models to see where we can improve upon them, essentially.
And my final thought has to do with the problem-solving courts. It seems to me that this kind of a program would be very applicable to the people that they serve. If you know some of the problem-solving courts, they're innovative, and I think they're pretty heavily on probation in terms of intensity, so in terms of their numbers. So this might really work hand in hand with developing more of the different problem-solving courts for drug addiction, use, and other things.
Yeah, one of the things we spoke with when we talked to probation is that it would be at their discretion. So the way it's structured is a lot of special supervision is actually separate from low risk. And so it would be up to them if like domestic violence was something they thought would work really well in the kiosk, it would be their discretion to decide who could and couldn't go on the kiosk.
One of the things that I recall not seeing in the budget was maintenance to maintain the kiosk. Is that a part of the contract with the company who installs the kiosk? How are they maintained? And also in New York or DC, are the kiosks currently, well, it wasn't clear whether the kiosks are currently in community-based neighborhoods, or are they just in the parole and probation office?
When we look at other cities, the kiosks seem to be primarily in high needs neighborhoods, and like our own plan, they're in representatives' offices or based in nonprofits, and that's kind of our intent. And then in terms of the maintenance of the actual machine itself, it is $2 to $4 per check-in, which over time would actually save the city money. Additionally, when we went to Wilmington to speak with their parole and probation department, we ourselves, put our finger in the fingerprinting kind of scanner and went through the whole process. And it's simple enough, and the technology has advanced enough, which is great for Philadelphia, that there really is, there are few errors that kind of go on. They've, worked out a lot of the kinks so far that have been occurring with this technology in other cities. The kind of IT people are based in Austin, Texas, and they have a direct line of communication with all of those cities that have this kind of technology. So when we were there, it seemed like a very sustainable way to use the technology because it's very streamlined. It actually can kind of display in different languages for those of people who, English is maybe not their native language. Just based on the questions it asks, it's a very simple technology, like I said before, that we think won't have many problems. So the maintenance should be relatively low, and our overhead costs actually include the cost of maintaining the system itself over time.
How do you jumpstart sort of the implementation timeline for this? It seems like, waiting 2 years effectively to start a $20,000 pilot is a problem in terms of the way we approach problem solving overall. If we had $20,000 right now, what are the steps and what sort of the timing that it would take in order to get this up and running?
So in an ideal world, we would have the $20,000 right now, but it seems APPD really does not have any extra funding right now. So the reason we started it in 2 years is because with researching federal funding grant deadlines, it wouldn't be able to put in grant applications until winter 2014. And then by the time the grant went through and we got approved, it wouldn't be able to start until 2015. If we had the $20,000 right now, this timeline would be moved up and it could start next winter instead of in 2 years.
What are those steps that you need to take to, if the dollars weren't the issue, what are kind of the other implementation steps?
There's not terribly too much to it. You would have to essentially find out what specifically where that pilot kiosk would go. Based on what we saw in other cities and in Wilmington, the kiosk itself is pretty much ready to go when you purchase it. So you get that set up and get it hooked up to APPD's system. And then I think that probably the only step that might take a little longer is working out having a probation officer there to monitor the kiosk during business hours. But those are basically the only things standing in between it getting going right now for the money.
We have time for one last question.
I guess I wanted to follow up on that, the idea of, you were talking about the two-tier kind of response that somebody might have. So you would need to man it during business hours?
Yeah,
Is that expense or cost?
Yeah, it appears that most cities do have somebody manning it, our idea would be to essentially have one of the probation officers rotate through manning that one kiosk, particularly probation officers who are serving that community. And the nice thing about that is, in addition to just having the job of being there and manning it, it also gets probation more active in the community, which they really currently aren't at all. And that's more of the traditional model of probation. It's also the way a lot of other law enforcement agencies like police and in some cities, DAs or offices are going, is trying to have more community-based operations.
And also, it wouldn't require hiring a new person. So it would only be like if there was someone who all their clients were in North Philly, instead of meeting them in the office for a day, they would meet them in North Philadelphia.
Thank you very much, Martha.